on his very last day in office, James Madison shocked Congress with what I consider to be the most important and most ignored presidential veto in history. This was in regards to the bonus bill in 1817, an infrastructure bill. And even though Madison supported the idea behind the legislation for more than 20 years, he still refused to sign off on the measure, even though he easily could have. And he said why. It's because the legislation that they passed in Congress didn't follow the strict limits of the Constitution, despite the fact that it aligned with President Madison's political goals in the long term. So on this episode, I've got all the juicy details and hopefully some lessons for all of us today. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, October 25th, 2024. And let's kick this off with a little background. Going back to George Washington's farewell address near the end of 1796, the first edition of this was actually drafted by James Madison in 1792. And here's one of Washington's warnings. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. TLDR, if you think we need more power, there's a process, and you know how to get it done. But he continued, let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The founding generation understood the danger of precedent. Once you establish a precedent that they can go beyond their limits, usurp power, exercise power not delegated in the Constitution, well then, as Jefferson warned in 1791, Congress then has a boundless field of power. So this was a serious warning, and that brings me to the discussion of federal power over roads and canals, infrastructure spending. And in 1796, Representative Madison, after some general remarks on the subject, this is from National Archives, he offered a resolution, the purport of which is to authorize the President of the United States to cause a survey of the Maine Post Road from Maine to Georgia, the expense to be defrayed out of the surplus revenue of the post office. This is primarily to show that Madison, even in the House of Representatives, in George Washington's second term, was making an effort to do something to do internal improvements, improve the post roads in the country. Now, Thomas Jefferson sent a letter over to Madison about this. I don't think he was super excited about it. He said, now, if you think about Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, Congress has delegated a power to establish post offices and post roads. And the key word is established to Jefferson, and as we'll see, Madison as well. He said, does the power to establish post roads given you by Congress mean that you shall make the roads, or only select from those already made those on which there shall be a post? He continued, if the term be equivocal, and I really do not think it so, which is the safest construction? That which permits a majority of Congress to go to cutting down mountains and bridging of rivers, or the other, which if too restricted may refer it to the states for amendment? No different than the warning from George Washington as well. We have these powers. You got to treat them as strictly as possible. Don't usurp power. And if you got a problem with it, if the people of the states want something different, there is a process to expand that power and stay within the safest construction of the Constitution. Now, in response, Madison basically told Jefferson a few weeks later, hey, I mostly agree here. And here's how he described it. I was not unaware of the considerations you suggest with regard to the post roads, but do not consider my proposition as involving any dangerous consequences. It is limited to the choice of roads where that is presented, and to the opening of them in other cases, so far only as may be necessary for the transportation of the mail. This, I think, fairly within the object of the Constitution. So Madison thought the federal government, just like Jefferson, could establish post roads, but not build brand new ones, maybe open some up and make them more passable. Now, his effort did not pass, but I have this other note that I wanted to add on here that I thought was really interesting. He said, if the route shall be once fixed for the post road, The local authorities will probably undertake the improvement, etc. of the roads, and individuals will go to work in providing the proper accommodations on them for general use. Can you imagine the mentality of most people today if there was a president saying, well, there's a bunch of roads now. We're going to do some to establish these as post roads, but the general improvement of them is going to be on a state or a local level, and in some cases, individual level. This would be seen as absolutely insane, but that's how James Madison approached it in 1796. Again, his effort did not pass, but he took a very similar view under the Constitution on canals, another piece of infrastructure spending from Congress back in the day. And here he is in a letter to Reynolds Chapman some years later describing this. He says, canals as an item in the general improvement of the country have always appeared to me not to be embraced by the authority of Congress. Check this out. It may be remarked that Mr. Hamilton, in his report on the bank, when enlarging the range of construction to his utmost of his ingenuity, admitted that canals were beyond the sphere of federal legislation. I mean, what better way can you put it than James Madison, the father of the Constitution, saying, hey, that guy Hamilton, remember him? When he was pushing for a national bank, 1790, 1791, issuing these reports, etc., and he was using all of his skill to expand federal power, how federal power is to be read. He still, in that case, even Hamilton admitted that canals were beyond the sphere of federal legislation. And he continued, he said, perhaps I ought not to omit the remark that although I concur, so he was on board with this, I concur in the defect of powers in Congress on the subject of internal improvements. My abstract opinion has been that in the case of canals particularly, the power would have been properly vested in Congress. So he's saying, this is something I wasn't happy about with the Constitution. Not everybody was 100% on board with anything, even James Madison. And he's saying, we wanted more power. I tried to get it, but we didn't. He said it was more than once proposed in the Convention of 1787, that's Philadelphia, and rejected. So they tried to include that. It was turned down. It was rejected from an apprehension, chiefly that it might prove an obstacle to the adoption of the Constitution. He was probably right, especially because adoption was so close as it was. And if they added even more power to the general government, it almost certainly wouldn't have passed. And I think that's really, really great insight there as well. Now that brings me to Madison as president. Here he is in near the end of his term already. His second term, his seventh annual message to Congress. These were always in December. This is December of 1815. He's urging Congress to take action. These roads are a wreck. You guys got to do something. Come on, let's do this. He says, among the means of advancing the public interest, the occasion is a proper one for recalling the attention of Congress to the great importance of establishing throughout our country the roads and canals which can be best executed under the national authority. He's pretty consistent. This is something that he wanted the federal government to have power to do in various forms for a long, long time. He said, it is a happy reflection, get this, that any defect of constitutional authority which may be encountered can be supplied in a mode which the Constitution itself has providently pointed out. This is Madisonian language. Everyone understood what he was saying, which is like, look, if what you decide to pass, he's not telling them what to pass because that's up to Congress. He's just saying my recommendation is we got to do something about the roads and the canals, and it should be under national authority. Now, you may do something much more limited, but if you need to, if you can find concurrence in the two chambers on something that would authorize more power, there's a mode in the Constitution to do this. Pass an amendment or send an amendment proposal to the states for consideration. And then again, the following year, his eighth and final message to Congress, Madison renewed this call. This is December of 1816. He said, I particularly invite again their attention, this is Congress, to the expediency of exercising their existing powers and, where necessary, of resorting to the prescribed mode of enlarging them, the amendment process, in order to effectuate a comprehensive system of roads and canals. It seems like some people in Congress ignored his repeated statements of, well, resorting to the prescribed mode of enlarging the powers. He said, such as will have the effect of drawing more closely together every part of our country by promoting intercourse and improvements and by increasing the share of every part in the common stock of national prosperity. You know, rah, rah. He's really trying to rally the troops here. Now, Adam White, in an article on infrastructure policy in American history, notes that Madison's message stirred, well, I would say a lot of people, but specifically, he says, Congressman John C. Calhoun, then a fierce young nationalist. Calhoun introduced the bonus bill, which proposed to earmark the bonus was the term, and dividends paid to the government by the National Bank as, quote, a permanent fund for internal improvement. So this was tying central banking and money from the central bank to permanently fund internal improvements. And here's how Calhoun put it. He said, we are under the most imperious obligation to counteract every tendency to disunion. So he was opposed to the idea of disunion, and he was trying to make sure that these infrastructure spending, these roads and canals, would keep everyone bonded together through commerce and, well, communication, etc. He said, let us then bind the republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space. It is thus the most distant parts of the republic will be brought within a few days' travel of the center. It is thus that a citizen of the West will read the news of Boston still moist from the press. Had a way with words, that guy, man, without a doubt. Now back to Adam White. He said, Speaker of the House Henry Clay joined Calhoun as a lead advocate of the bonus bill. So they have pretty powerful, well-known guys in the House and the Senate pushing this. Louisiana, there were some amendments offered. Louisiana Representative Thomas Bowling Robertson attempted to mitigate the federal prerogative, though not the federal funds, by allocating those funds to the relevant state in proportion to population. So they're trying to deal with that rather than the project merit. And Representative Timothy Pickering of Massachusetts proposed to subject any federal project to the state's veto power. So each state could say no. Both, I'm not sure if that meant individual states, each individual state, or if the states collectively, I'm not sure. But both amendments passed over the objections of both Calhoun and Clay. Though this was probably for the best, writes Adam, as even with those limitations on federal power, the bonus bill only barely passed the House by a vote of 86 to 84. So just 2 votes in the House, and it was only 20 to 15 in the Senate. It was pretty quickly sent over to President Madison, who was winding down the last days of his 2 terms in office. And on March 2nd, 1817, 2 days, I think technically, because the 3rd was his last day. The 4th was, I believe, President James Monroe's inaugural address. So Madison was kind of passing the baton 2 days after. On March 2nd, 1817, this is from Drew McCoy's book, The Last of the Fathers, a group of Republican congressmen, this bill had passed, called on the chief executive to tender their congratulations and official farewell. But what had promised to be a pleasant formality on a quiet Sunday in Washington took an unexpected turn. John C. Calhoun had taken leave of the president and started for the door when he was abruptly called back. Come on back here, John. Madison then took him aside, and that was my ad. Madison took him aside and broke the news privately. You know, he offered him that respect because he knew Calhoun worked on this pretty hard. As one of his last acts in office, he intended to veto on constitutional grounds the bonus bill. And so Calhoun, they say, said he was taken entirely by surprise. He assumed the administration's support of the bill, but he assumed wrongly. And back to Adam White, he said, according to Speaker Clay, no circumstance, not even an earthquake that should have swallowed up half this city, could have excited more surprise. They had no idea. So in a last-minute desperate move, here's what Henry Clay asked James Madison to do. This is March 3rd, 1817. This is really the last day that Madison is conducting business as president at the end of 8 years in office. And here's how he put it. Dear sir, knowing that we cannot differ on the question of the object of the internal improvement bill, however we may on the constitutional point, will you excuse me for respectively suggesting whether you could not leave the bill to your successor, James Monroe? Now, I should do a follow-up episode on Monroe and these infrastructure bills, but I don't think that would have played out too well. But really, if you think about it, if you think as president and that something is unconstitutional and it's presented to you and you really actually adhere to your oath of office, what are you going to do? Just step aside and then not do your job and veto it and just pass it? Well, this is what politicians do. They do these kind of sneaky backroom deals. And I think Madison was I don't really have any record of this, but I think he was kind of bothered by the whole process of the legislation on this. But Henry Clay suggested, you know what, I know you think this is unconstitutional. I know we agree on the goal of this. That was very clear. But don't veto it. Let Monroe, let your buddy take care of this, and maybe we can convince him to get it done. Now, I'm not sure what to make of this, but there's a pretty interesting footnote at the National Archives on this letter from Henry Clay to James Madison. I'm interested in what you think of this. In his speech on this bill on February 4th, 1817, Clay urged the House to do no more than approve in principle the pledge to establish the fund for future internal improvements. Quote, if we attempt anything beyond this, if we touch the details, if we go into a specification of the objects on which the fund is to be expended, the inevitable effect will be that we shall do nothing. My gut instinct is that he was saying on the House floor, if we try to do too much, we're going to get nothing done. Does that mean he thought that Madison would veto it or that maybe the Senate would reject it? I'm not certain, but he thought that trying to do too much would be a bad choice, and it looks like that's exactly what happened. Anyways, here to Dave Benner in an article that we've cited many times over the years. He said on the last day of his administration then, March 3rd, 1817, President James Madison vetoed the Bonus Bill of 1817, a plan that called for federal construction and funding of various roads, bridges, canals throughout the country. In a letter to Congress, this was actually to the House of Representatives, the president explained his rationale. Out of all historical writings on constitutional interpretation, Dave writes, I believe it stands today as one of the most important. I agree. And I also think this was the most important veto. Maybe there's something else out there that I've missed, but this one, I think maybe the story will make it clear. Madison's reasoning was simple, writes Benner. Although he personally favored the idea of infrastructure construction, writing that he was, quote, not unaware of the great importance of these things, he denied the policy's constitutionality on a federal level. And so Dave points out the impact of this, something that we don't see politicians really ever do today. They favor something. They don't say, hey, we got to get this healthcare thing planned. I'm really on board with this, but we need a constitutional amendment, or I think you've gone too far with this, so I'm going to veto it. In general, what we see politicians do in the White House in my entire life, and probably much longer than that, is they get these must-sign bills, and maybe they put a signing statement saying, I think such and such is unconstitutional and isn't going to hold up, but this is so important, I'm going to sign it anyways. Not Madison. Instead of upholding his own personal proclivities, Dave writes, and allowing the Constitution to be undermined, he maintained that the Constitution was one of specific enumerated powers, and the document contained no express power for the federal government to do such a thing. And here from his veto message, March 3rd, 1817, the same day that Henry Clay basically asked him to set aside his principles and his oath of office to let something go anyways, he said, I am constrained by the insuperable difficulty I feel in reconciling the bill with the Constitution of the United States to return it with that objection to the House of Representatives in which it originated. Then he goes on. Madison writes, the legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated in the 8th section of the first article of the Constitution, and it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers, or that it falls by any just interpretation of the necessary and proper clause, is what he's getting to, within the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution those other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. Now, of course, supporters of the bonus bill made all kinds of constitutional arguments. Back then they still at least tried to pretend. Like if someone would say this is unconstitutional, they'd make an explanation. Oh, this is general welfare. This is necessary and proper. This is commerce. And you see these arguments happening, especially if you go back to the Bank Bill of 1791. James Madison, Edmund Randolph, Thomas Jefferson went through each of the arguments under those various clauses and explained how they were wrong. Now, here's Madison on the veto message to the bonus bill discussing an expansive view of the Commerce Clause. He said the power to regulate commerce among the several states cannot include a power to construct roads and canals and to improve the navigation of watercourses in order to facilitate, promote, and secure such a commerce, without a latitude of construction departing from the ordinary import of the terms, strengthened by the known inconveniences, which doubtless led to the grant of this remedial power to Congress. So we know that the Annapolis Convention in 1786 and the eventual call for the Philadelphia Convention to draft amendments to the Articles of Confederation and eventually the Constitution for the United States, he's saying, like, look, we were having problems with regulating commerce and we understand everything that it was all about. And those of us who approve this, we know that this did not authorize a power to construct roads and canals. Not at all. Can you imagine someone saying that to the federal government today? You can't construct roads with federal power? Well, that's how James Madison, the father of the Constitution, put it. Would you be surprised that they also tried to claim that this was okay under general welfare? I think, and I'm not sure, someone else probably knows better than I, but I think John C. Calhoun was actually the one really pushing the general welfare approach. And he said, this is Madison, to refer the power in question to the clause to provide for the common defense and general welfare would be contrary to the established and consistent rules of interpretation, as rendering the special and careful enumeration of powers which follow the clause nugatory and improper. There'd be no point. You're just basically giving them power to do whatever they think is in the general welfare, and it's not qualified by the powers delegated that follow that in Article 1, Section 8. He said such a view of the Constitution would have the effect of giving to Congress a general power of legislation, i.e. unlimited power, instead of the defined and limited one hitherto understood to belong to them. The terms common defense and general welfare embracing every object and act within the purview of a legislative trust. This was, well, unfortunately, that's how they treat it today. But he warned us that if you allow them that construction, you're basically giving them unlimited, a general legislative power. That is actually something he kind of advocated for in the Philadelphia Convention with the Virginia plan. Him and Edmund Randolph and a few others, he wanted very broad federal legislative power and a veto power over the states. But even though this is a kind of thing he was in favor of a really strong national centralized government, he didn't get it. So here he is holding again to the principle that, well, this is not what we approved. And he continued talking about this regarding even just the spending of the money. He said a restriction of the power to provide for the common defense and general welfare to cases which are to be provided for by the expenditure of money would still leave within the legislative power of Congress all the great and most important measures of government, money being the ordinary and necessary means of carrying them into execution. So if you're saying, well, we're not going to construct the roads and canals, we're just going to spend money on it. He's saying, like, no. Then you're making the claim that you can just spend money on pretty much anything. So he wrapped it up this way, reiterating that he wanted to see improvements power in the hands of the federal government. But if this is the way, if this is what they wanted to do, it had to be done by an amendment to the Constitution, what he said in his annual message in 1815 and in 1816. And when he waited to see what they passed something far beyond what he had asked for. Well, and less. So he asked for, do what you can do within the bounds of the Constitution, and anything beyond that, give me an amendment, or let me see an amendment to this. He said, I am not unaware of the great importance of roads and canals and the improved navigation of watercourses, and that a power in the national legislature to provide for them might be exercised with signal advantage to the general prosperity. But seeing that such a power is not expressly given by the Constitution, and believing that it cannot be deduced from any part of it without an inadmissible latitude of construction and a reliance on insufficient precedents, believing also that the permanent success of the Constitution depends on a definite partition of powers between the general and state governments, and that no adequate landmarks would be left by the constructive extension of the powers of Congress as proposed in the bill. Again, he's saying, if you read it like this, there are no limits on federal power. He said, I have no option but to withhold my signature from it and to cherishing the hope that its beneficial objects may be attained by a resort for the necessary powers to the same wisdom and virtue in the nation which established the Constitution in its actual form and providently marked out in the instrument itself. He's talking about Article 5, the amendment process. It's in there if you want to expand the power. This is a safe and practicable mode of improving it, as experience might suggest. So he's really just hammering home, like, I'm on board with this kind of thing, but I'm vetoing it because what you gave me to sign is way beyond what you're authorized to do. So there's no chance. Now, they did actually make a last-minute effort to override the veto, probably, I don't know the date, I'm assuming it was while he was still there on the 3rd, and that failed. It wasn't very close at all. And he's writing about this again to President James Monroe later in the year, December of 1817. All of these original source documents will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get a blog post organized on that, and I will get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But here in his letter to James Monroe, he said, serious danger seems to be threatened to the genuine sense of the Constitution, not only by an unwarrantable latitude of construction, but by the use made of precedents which cannot be supposed to have had, in the view of their authors, the bearing contended for, and even where they may have crept through inadvertence into acts of Congress and been signed by the executive at a midnight hour, in the midst of a group scarcely admitting perusal and under a weariness of mind as little admitting of vigilant attention. Those, hey, must pass bills, hundreds of pages of things. It's so important. National emergency. Got to get done. All right. Midnight hour. I'll sign it. This establishes a precedent. Just like I was mentioning at the beginning of the show here today, once you establish that precedent, this is what does threatens the genuine sense of the Constitution. And then he said, another and perhaps a greater danger is to be apprehended from the influence which the usefulness and popularity of measures may have on questions of their constitutionality. So many people, I hear almost constantly, people confuse stuff I like with the word constitutional and stuff I don't like as unconstitutional. And James Madison, with his actions here, whether he was always consistent on this kind of thing or not, certainly here when it comes to the bonus bill and to infrastructure spending and infrastructure building under federal power under the Constitution, he's incredibly consistent. But he's pointing out that when things are super useful and super popular, that people tend to say, well, that must be constitutional. They try to shoehorn it in. And that's what George Washington warned about in 1796. He said, let there be no change by usurpation, because even if it's the instrument of good, it's a weapon to destroy freedom. He said, it is difficult. This is back to Madison. It is difficult to conceive that anything short of that influence could have overcome the constitutional and other objections to the bill on roads and canals, which passed the two houses at the last session. And in an 1831 letter to Nicholas P. Trist, Madison reiterated that his view of the Constitution remained the same to that day. Here it is, 14 years later. And he said, as to the power in relation to roads and canals, my opinion, without any previous variance from it, was formally announced in the veto on the bonus bill in 1817, and no proof of a subsequent change has been given. Man, so his final act as president, the father of the Constitution, James Madison, stuck with his oath to the Constitution, just like George Washington said we should do, rather than sign a bill to do something that really, politically, he was fully on board with. On top of it, he could have easily just passed the buck, say, well, I'm not going to veto it, but I'm also not going to sign, so I'm not violating the Constitution. We'll leave it to Monroe and see if he'll do it. But he chose his duty over political preferences, over political expedience. That's why I see Madison's veto of the bonus bill in 1817 as the most important in history and the most ignored one, because it's super important, because it's the principle that no one seems to have today. And it's super ignored because even if people have learned about this, I know I didn't until recent years, it's ignored. The principle, the approach to dealing to the oath of office is totally ignored today. I don't think we've seen any president do anything remotely close to as honest and principled as this in the 200 plus years since. Now, I don't know about you, but I never learned about any of this stuff in government-run schools, so you shouldn't be surprised that no one acts like this today either. And that's why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles of the Constitution and liberty. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to supporting us to date. You can also do a few free and easy peasy things to help us spread the word. Smashing the like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts, comments in the archive, subscribing, getting notifications, all the things that you can do on the mainstream platforms, sharing, etc. Those will help trigger algorithms, and it tells them to show us to more people. And the more, especially like on the video platforms, the more time you spend watching something, the more that they are going to try to find other people who are willing to watch and learn as well. So again, thank you so much for being here. Again, I'm going to be off on Monday. That is my 21st anniversary, so there's no chance. I'd love to hang out with you guys, but I'm going to wait till Wednesday and Friday of next week. I'm taking off on Monday, and then I'll be back to my regular schedule going forward after that. So I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday, here on the Path to Liberty.